We are Friends United.
We are Friends United.
We are Friends United.
Together, we are Friends United.
What does reconciliation mean to you in terms of the Indigenous people in Canada now?
I find it to be a tricky word. And I think that it's easy to sort of speak about reconciliation without really unpacking the many layers and the fact that it's ultimately a process. So the layers are personal, they're institutional, they're legal, they're about worldviews. They're about small communities and large communities. They're economic to a certain extent. At its heart, it's a concept that is about relationships, however. It's about seeing each other in a way that respects the different approaches to how we have two-eyed seeing, different ways of seeing the world, but that we're in it with each other. And we are committed to finding a path forward that is born from mutual respect and respect for each other, respect for the broader world, and increasingly I'd want to emphasize respect for the future generations that are really being dealt a blow in real time by the choices that we're making in our relationships with each other.
And I feel when you're talking about that need for reconciliation to not just be at a governmental or organizational or community level even, but to be individual responsibility, I think about the fact that this center, Friends United, the initiative, is very much about, it may not be beyond reproach. Is it the perfect form of reconciliation? You say that, is there any perfect form? But it's an amazing example of an individual who happens to be Rolf, who is an immigrant, who said, I want to do my part to build bridges and to offer some sort of reconciliation. What was your response when you first were exposed to Friends United?
Yeah, so Rolf's amazing example is a really interesting one that I think can be a model for people who sort of are able to shine a light on, in this case, I think through art, really profoundly both all things associated with the importance of reconciliation and really meaning it and being, putting your resources and time and talent behind something. But doing it through art strikes me as a stroke of genius.
Hello and welcome, Gwe. This is the Friends United International Convention Centre in Unama'ki, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, Canada. Thanks for joining us for our second annual Friends United Reconciliation Talks. I'm joined now by Danny Graham, who is the Chief Engagement Officer for Engage Nova Scotia, but that's not what we're talking about today. And actually, we will get to it, but it's not why we have you here. And I think in the interest of transparency, I have to also say right away, Danny is my brother-in-law.
And your buddy.
And my buddy. He was my buddy long before he was my brother-in-law.
That's true.
But you've also been someone from whom I've learned so much about the concept of reconciliation long before Canadians were talking about it.
Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning for you.
Sure.
And tell me about, let's start with the question, who are you and where did you come from?
So thanks, Nancy. It's wonderful to be here, and this is an exciting initiative, and obviously everything associated with Friends United is really profound and sort of demonstrating the way that reconciliation is a responsibility for all of us as individuals, regardless of what sector we come from. So it's a real honor to have a chance as a settler and coming from a settler family to be able to offer some perspectives and as much questions as anything else. I was reflecting on the settler heritage that I have as we were thinking about this conversation. And, the bare bones of it are that I come from Scottish heritage. And so Nova Scotia has been settled by Scottish people dating back hundreds of years. That's the line that I've been with. I grew up around Antigonish and predominantly, though, on Unama'ki here in Cape Breton in Sydney. I was one of 10 children who, when we first arrived in 1968, actually attended St. Anthony Daniel School.
When you first arrived in Sydney, you mean?
When we first arrived in Sydney.
Not from Scotland. I just wanted to...
I didn't. You would notice that. My accent isn't of a Scottish type. It's more of a Cape Bretoner. So we arrived in the community that's really contiguous with Member 2. And my classmates from elementary school, junior high, and high school were all from the Member 2 First Nation. And at that time, back in the 60s and 70s, it was at a time when, from an economic development perspective, from a leadership perspective, it wasn't thought of Member 2 as a place of leadership. And so much has changed since then. Under the leadership of many people, councils, Chief Terry Paul in particular, and now you can't even think about Cape Breton without thinking of all the First Nations, all 5 First Nations, Mi'kmaq First Nations here, and Member 2 in particular, as an internationally recognized place where leadership is really profoundly informing mainstream society economically and socially. And it's a delight to be back and to reflect on what's the journey been. That journey for me has included a period of time in law where I became exposed to approaches to law that are more closely connected to, but not exactly the same as Indigenous traditions, restorative justice. And back about 15 years ago, and for a period of about 10 years, I became involved in Nova Scotia as the province's lead negotiator on Aboriginal rights and reconciliation.
And that's largely why you're here today. But I want to go back. You were a defense lawyer for a while, and I remember a story about one of the kids coming home from an early grade in elementary and having told his friends at school that my dad has friends who are robbers. And I'm curious about what that experience of being a defense lawyer taught you.
Yeah, I think we often think of defense lawyers through a strictly legal lens, and that they are sort of fighting a fight that is sort of carved out of black and letter legislation and laws and that sort of thing. I felt as a defense lawyer, frankly, that I was more of a storyteller than I was a litigant. And most of the time that I appeared in court, it was actually to tell a story about somebody who, for one reason or another, had fallen off the rails and didn't have the advantages that I had in growing up. So as I increasingly sunk into the reality of how other people's lives were very different from mine, and I was trying to share this with my children about everyone having a story, it ultimately landed in the mind of my 7-year-old son, Andrew, who had heard, I think, enough times that even my clients have stories. And that in part was what informed my interest in restorative justice, and that there's something other than the traditional way or the conventional way, the Eurocentric way of holding people accountable could be a more effective way to sort of bring about community healing and reconciliation in a more micro kind of environment. So,
you talk about having been at school with kids who were from the Mi'kmaq communities, and I'm curious to know what that experience was like and what inequities you saw then, but also how you then came to be much more involved and exposed to Indigenous culture in Canada than most Canadians.
Well, the early days, I was reflecting on this a couple of weeks ago when I had heard from someone that two friends of mine who I had lost contact with really since high school have since passed. I haven't lived in Sydney for a long period of time, but Mickey Herney and Wayne Guinish were friends of mine. And when I left Cape Breton many years ago, I often thought about what's the path, what's the story, what are the circumstances that they might find themselves in. And in hearing it retold from someone just recently, it made me realize just how many struggles they fought with that were just happened to be the circumstances that they found themselves in and couldn't find their way out of. Now, some of it was health related, but
also representative of so many people in Indigenous communities.
Sometimes as Canadians, we like to think of the way that we are ranked by the OECD or the United Nations or large organizations about the level of well-being and wellness of our citizens. But if you were to just look at those people in Canada who are Indigenous, who particularly live on reserve and so on, the story of Canadians is not something that we could and should be proud of. And it's something that obviously requires really careful consideration about the inequities that exist across the country. I had started eventually, part of the sort of national perspective that I got came after, in the late 1990s, I had spearheaded the establishment of the Nova Scotia Restorative Justice Program. And it was at the time that Canada was beginning to finally see that the approach that we have generally taken to holding people accountable has been often counterproductive, and particularly counterproductive in Indigenous context. And so it was around the time of the Gladue decision, the Moses decision by Barry Stewart up north, as seminal places where we started to reimagine a criminal justice system, and in our case, a youth justice system that was different. So I was fortunate to go to Ottawa and lead the establishment of a national restorative justice program, and it brought me to the stories of people on and off reserve from one end of the country to the other that really brought home the consistent nature with which Indigenous Canadians were being systemically left behind and not part of the main opportunities of society.
What was your personal journey from the first time you heard about restorative justice in law school to that position, being in that position?
That's really interesting. I haven't thought about this in a while, but I can remember actually sitting in my first year law school, and Wade McLaughlin was my criminal law professor, and he started to talk about... Who went
on to be the premier of Prince Edward Island.
Yep. And he was telling us about these alternative approaches to criminal justice. And I grew up in a home life where I thought, people do harm, you give them a whack, you do something really bad, you get a double whack, and everything should be fine. And
five brothers, five sisters.
It was a bit of a rough and tumble sort of approach. And generally it worked because of the environment that we sat in. But when he started to talk about these alternative approaches to holding people accountable that were informed by Indigenous approaches to life, I thought it was just sort of some soft touch, weak-kneed, lefty kind of idea, and that the effective way to hold people accountable is through the red meat of hard justice that I was brought up with, and many people with colonial pasts would have seen as being the norm. What in fact is true about justice itself is that this idea of penal systems and courts and paying fines to the state and all the rest is a fairly recent invention across all countries and all cultures relative to the norm, where you have community conversations about what really went wrong and how do we sort of find a way to make it whole for a community, something that in a North American Indigenous context has been kept. So it was quite a swing from first year law school to being ultimately somebody who in Nova Scotia, nationally and elsewhere, was advancing an approach that actually was not exactly the way that I was
it's even strange for me to hear you say that, knowing you as I do.
Yeah.
It's strange for me to hear you say that you had that view.
First reaction.
But that's how we learn, isn't it?
Oh, this is exactly the way that law professors sort of push their lefty kind of ideas on unsuspecting law students in some ways. But in the end, I mean, my experience as a defense lawyer was a very discouraging one, frankly, because my clients generationally, like the parents of, the children of, were cycling in and out of a criminal justice system and learning very little about what was happening. And so I think one of the important things in this context to recognize is that restorative justice has many meanings in many places to many different cultures and people. And that
can be challenging to talk about it as one thing.
It sure can. And it's particularly challenging because the richness that is held in the many different communities across Canada, for example, about how to hold people accountable can be different from one tribal group to another tribal group. So it's certainly not the case that there's one version of restorative justice that holds for everyone. But what is clear when one dials into it is that what's a really common thread is this notion of relationships being at the heart and foundation of what a strong and healthy society is, and community, that it's the responsibility of everyone to sort of see more deeply into the challenges that we all have. And that has been an integral value in Indigenous communities all across the world for a long period of time. And they didn't contract their way out of it by hiring judges and police and others to sort of take care of the messiness of life. They actually continued to recognize that a whole society, a strong community, is one that sort of holds everyone accountable and also recognizes that everyone makes mistakes. And the most effective way for continued safety in a community is to make sure that we figure out the complexity of the challenges that bring people into conflict with the law. Mm-hmm. Those complexities have been running through First Nations and Indigenous communities in Canada for so long, with so much judgment, obviously, as it relates to the criminal justice system, which was sort of the foundation from which I first started to open up to alternative ways of justice.
It's like the difference between being a system all about blame and punishment to understanding and rehabilitation.
Yeah, understanding and relationship. I mean, this has been the case, in Africa, it was known as Ubuntu. It was, the notion that we are inseparable from each other. We are one because we each exist, and we are one with everything else that's generally out there. We are part of this greater something, and ultimately it's a lot more profound. The simplistic approach of sending people, by and large, that's not to say that we should do away with all the penal systems that we have, but it has been a largely ineffective approach towards having whole communities and safe and happy ones. And that's demonstrated in those countries that rely on a more penal approach to justice than, for example, Canada does, which frankly is one that's at the high end of a more punitive approach relative to other Western countries.
So through this week of conversations, but also through the past number of years, I've been getting this feeling like our Indigenous people in the world really had it right in so many ways historically. And the pendulum has swung so far through colonization to over here. And it's like we're realizing now when we look at our environment and our disconnection from each other and so on, that we really need to bring that pendulum back. And I mentioned to someone the other day that, I feel like we should be in a state of reverence for our Indigenous people. And she said, I think it was Shannon Monk said, we don't want reverence, we want equality. I was glad she said it in the middle of the conversation. It was such a good learning for me. But I did say, I think that my point of view comes from the idea that Eric Schweg said in our conversation that, it's about the human family and we should all have reverence for each other, period. And that goes to the connection that you talk about. What did you experience personally during that time working in the project on restorative justice and all your experience with communities, wherever you went in the country? What did you experience that helped you learn what differences there were in the way our colonized world works and how their systems made sense?
Yeah, there's a lot in there that brings up thoughts about experiences that I've had both in the criminal justice system and outside of it. And the one that's most prominent for me really relates to the notion that, it's going to sound cliche, but putting oneself in the moccasins of someone else is at the heart of what a healthy society generally does. And so as I think back to my journey as I was trying to sort of work my way through it, the first thing I recognize is that it's still a journey. I'm still trying to sort of, there isn't a right, and I don't know many people even who with North American Indigenous backgrounds who would say for themselves that we had it entirely right. It was the dismissal of other approaches. It was the presumption that somehow we were going to be able to buy our way out of safe communities, healthy communities that has been alive for me the most in recent years around all of this. So we come from each other, and therefore the responsibility to make it whole and make it right in a community is one that we have to work out together. There's something about the messiness of that. And so I think this extrapolates to many of the ways in which we are experiencing problems in society more generally. We think that what we need to be healthy is to have a strong healthcare system, and so we pay our way through creating healthcare systems without looking at the wellness of people as the sort of the organizing kind of question. We assume that because the economists are able to grow the economy, that everybody is somehow going to do well in society, and that doesn't appear to be so. That is leaving too many people behind. So I think there's so much to be learned about a holistic approach that where there's a shared responsibility, where we're not trying to contract out to police and corrections and judges and lawyers to make our communities safe, but instead we look back and we say, okay, what have we missed along the way? What have we tried to sort of, I'm using this term, buy our way out of, that you can't buy your way out of in the messiness of life, that has been part of traditions from one end of the globe to the other. that we are, I think, now, as we see our climate challenges, our fragile democracy, needing to lean back into to say, okay, that general direction wasn't working before. What are the things we need to be, what are the questions we should be asking ourselves about a successful society that will allow us to find our way back to wholeness and connection that's been increasingly missing.
And I remember that your relationship with Indigenous people and exposure to their communities actually influenced how you parented when your older boys were young. And probably now, even more so, but I just remember learning about it then. Can you talk about that?
Well, it was restorative justice generally, which was, as I said, informed by Indigenous perspectives. And the accountability process for my children when they were growing up were circle processes. So not to appropriate somebody else's process, it was just that we got far more understanding and results as a result of letting go of the punishment sort of stick and bringing up the relationship quotient of our conversation. So at the time, my kids would say things, another circle, Dad? But they have, as adults now, looked back and said, I'm really glad that the approach was something that was subtler than what I might have otherwise have taken. So again, that's every parent has a different story about this. And, while it's consistent with an approach that would be Indigenous, I suspect that there are many richer sort of ways in which Indigenous communities have sort of imagined the relationship that they would have with their children and their connection to the natural world that I wish I had learned from as well.
That you've been on a learning journey. And I'm curious, when you say relationship, are there specific, I'm guessing there are specific relationships with Indigenous people that you met on your path that really awakened you or changed your trajectory? Can you think of anyone in particular?
I can think of many people. I think in general, my experience predominantly has been with the Mi'kmaq people. And in my role as the province's lead negotiator on Aboriginal rights and reconciliation for almost 10 years, I had the good fortune to get to know many of their leaders. And I was quite taken by the patience and openness that they had about the processes that we were together trying to work our way through. In the course of that assignment that I was carrying for the province, I did, however, have a special experience with Dan Christmas, now Senator Dan Christmas, where we were asked to travel around Nova Scotia and talk about the story, the richer, deeper story, which Dan, of course, knew much better than I did. And we would speak to business audiences and the Bar Society, and we would travel from one end of the province to the other, just sort of opening up conversations about what does this notion of reconciliation kind of mean. And Dan had it at the back of his hand, and I was struck so much by the equanimity that he still had and the fortitude to sort of tell the story of the excruciating sort of pain points in Mi'kmaq history and still being at the table and not sort of thumping it himself. And his description about so many different levels that were rights related, but the effective abduction of children was the thing that was just the most heartbreaking part of my listening to his story, and try to imagine, as any parent, what it would be like for everybody to lose their children to residential schools. I mean, it's both the effect that it has on the children, But just imagine the decades of not having children in your community and all that came through. So it's not my experience to sort of describe, but in the spirit...
But you were learning about that long before the majority of Canadians were.
Yeah, I was imbued in the questions earlier on. And so the question that when Dan and I traveled, that I shared with, Nova Scotia communities of people and sectors was, so just imagine and close your eyes for a moment and imagine that there's a flotilla of people from another country and another language and another religion who arrive in Halifax Harbour or Sydney Harbour or someplace like that today. Yeah. Just imagine that would happen, and then they all off board and they don't have passports or any of the clearances, and they say, kind of like it here. Do you mind if I stick around for a little while? Not knowing anything and having a particularly welcoming communal sense.
And not really meaning it, do you mind?
Yeah,
right?
Perhaps,
like not really saying, do you mind?
Let's give it a try was kind of the approach that was taken. And then, I mean, first of all, what would our reaction be today? What would it call up in us to have the sense of generosity to say, let's give it a try? Hard to imagine that we'd be quite there right now. And then when one looks at the cascade of different issues that includes the diseases that were one of the first impacts that came to Indigenous people, Mi'kmaq, we were settled in, Turtle Island was settled from east to west, and the wiping out of things followed by all of the other appropriations of property, which really wasn't a concept in Indigenous worlds, to eventually appropriating your children to residential schools. It was just so Dan and I would have that kind of conversation with the community. And then when he reminded us of just how sophisticated the governance structures were in all across Wabanaki, which is the Atlantic Canadian sort of region, down through the United States even, just how sophisticated it was from a governance model. You just sort of said, how did we sort of assume so much about, as Dan Paul said, how could we have possibly have been considered the savages in that situation? So anyway.
Well, I mean, ego plays such a big part in it as well. The settlers brought their ways and their beliefs that they knew what was right. And, these quote unquote savages must be wrong. So ego is a whole other element, but it's very much about separation instead of connection. And what do you think you learned most from your time in that role with Dan Christmas and with so many others?
I think the predominant thing that maybe I'll just share a little bit about how the process came about.
Yeah, please.
And how it continues to this day.
Yeah, what did it look like?
Yeah, so there was the Mi'kmaq were, amongst other things, a semi-nomadic people who fished substantially, moved around what we now call Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaqi, and as a fishing people, there was an Aboriginal right to fish for food, social, and ceremonial kinds of purposes. But in the 1700s, there were treaties signed, which were intended to go beyond something like that. That was actually the Peace and Friendship Treaties were intended to sort of ensure that together we would work it out in the spirit of peace and friendship. But this concept of, property rights, it was a really asymmetric kind of relationship on many different fronts. And so there was a long period of time after the 1700s where these treaties, like hundreds of years, where they were essentially ignored and the validation of them were ignored. And the first probably the biggest final victory that started to turn the tables happened in the late 1990s with the Marshall fishing decisions that happened through the Supreme Court of Canada. And what the Supreme Court acknowledged was the validity of the right of the Mi'kmaq to fish, to have a livelihood fishery, and it sent a clear message to mainstream governments that we can't continue to ignore this issue of reconciliation. We need to sort of lean in on matters that at first had some very basic rights, resources, and land and governance kinds of questions associated with it. So after the 1990s, a process was begun called the Made in Nova Scotia process, and it's essentially about reconciling rights in some fashion. And at the time, it was imagined that over a period of time, notionally 9 or 10 years, we would be able to somehow have a negotiated settlement about what our respective interest in legal rights and resources and land and et cetera were. And, it was well intended, but in the end, from my perspective, still adopting this notion that we were that ignored relationship and ignored the process of building each other, building trust toward a better relationship that we could have. And so I was part of a process that is ongoing, that very much needs to sort of bring greater understanding to the respective ways in which fishing and forestry and land control and governance and so much more gets addressed. But it's not something that is simple enough to wrap up into a series of just agreements. It's about something more fundamental. And this notion that really rose up in me over that period of time as I was sort of carrying Nova Scotia's position was that, and we hear it more often now, is that we're all treaty people. Those treaties were signed by the Crown, of which I was then a representative. And on Treaty Day, we need to all come out and sort of recognize that there was a shared intention when we signed those to come together in a process that was much more about process than it was about legal agreements. So of the things that I learned perhaps most, it was that the law and agreements and rights are an important component of getting us to where we need to be. Let's ensure that we continue to make more and better progress on that. But all of it moves at the speed of trust. It moves at the speed of understanding, and there's no summit on a mountain that says you've arrived at a place of reconciliation. We will be forever learning from each other. But I hope and expect making more space and more room for the wisdom that comes from Mi'kmaq and other Indigenous leaders to sort of really show us the ways in which the colonial perspectives, our veneration of material, our presumptions about economic growth taking care of everyone just need to be rethought, and that a strong society is one that has been understood for a longer period of time for many cultures, but is one that has relationships and the equity of relationships at the center of what makes it strong and whole.
It sounds like it was the kind of process where much of your learning was about learning how much you had to learn, or we have to learn.
Still a lot of learning.
Right.
I want to sort of exercise a level of caution about even sharing these ideas, frankly, full stop, because I'm on a journey like everyone else, trying to understand, trying to unlearn all the things that have been cultured into me. So I hope that I arrive each day with more questions and better questions and more courage to stay with the discomfort of the answers that come out when those questions are dealt with more deeply. So I think that it will take that forever kind of period. But
it's about progress.
It's about progress in the process. It's about understanding that it's a process, and that getting there is about more than what's written on paper. It's about more than even what's in your head. It's about the journey that one holds for themselves as an individual, and our ability to get to a place that is more grounded and has greater potential is deeply dependent on our ability as individuals to just sort of accept that we've made big mistakes. And it doesn't mean that you continue to beat yourself up about all of those mistakes, because everyone across all cultures are capable of really messing up. And it is, however, doing one's best to sort of dig in and say, okay, now that I know that, next Treaty Day, October 1st in Nova Scotia, what might you do? Next Orange Shirt Day, what does it mean for you? How do you pause? The next time you pick up a book or ask yourself a question, what will I lean into? It will be part of it. And the hope that I have, sort of a perspective that I have through my work at Engage Nova Scotia is informed by those journeys a great deal, where we often talk about moving the needle and action and trying to get her done kind of stuff. All important to sort of keep in mind. But I think we will, over the longer term, be more effective at what it is that we're wanting to do for our children in 7 generations and so on, if we actually slow down, if we open up and we soften to the reality of everyone's circumstances, including the circumstances, frankly, of other animals that roam the earth and have had a particularly challenging time. Not to mention
Raw deal.
the raw deal is quite apparent, and hard to imagine with the many extinctions that we've been accelerating toward in recent generations, that would have been rather different if we had given ourselves a different frame of what a good society kind of looks like. And this has actually been around for a long period of time. These concepts are not inconsistent with Eastern philosophy and a number of other traditions from other parts of the world that saw a wholeness that was more complete than the one that became automated to this growth mindset, a material growth mindset that really, around the time of the Renaissance and others, really got deeply rooted in Europe and then exported to much of the rest of the world for a long time.
I mentioned the other day, but I always remember how powerful it was having J. Bell Redbird, who was a friend of mine, and who I feel like I learned so much from in the short time I knew him. But he showed me the little lines that came out of each point in his painting and told me that was symbolic of the fact that we are connected to everything. And we're connected to the environment, to the animals, to everything. And that sense of connection is so different than how our societies, so many of our societies on Earth today are living and treating the planet and the animals and so on. What is the work you're doing at Engage Nova Scotia? What's your elevator pitch? How can you explain it in a nugget? Because it is profound and it contains so much, but give us an explanation.
Yeah, and just before I bridge to that, I just want to pick up on your oneness sort of comment, because it's something that I do believe, but it's taken me a while to sort of really get a vague notion of what that oneness kind of looks like, because it does, I think, to many people sound rather esoteric and just be I'd be inclined, as I think about my own journey towards actually feeling committed to that, but still not really fully understanding what it is, try to imagine in the way that we were just talking about the healthcare system and the justice system and others being reimagined, all things related to the learning that we open up for our children in schools and education, to the oneness of it all. If we were to, it wouldn't seem so esoteric, I think, if we were to be finding ways to educate our children with and in and amongst all things that are in the natural world, instead of in other things that we sort of, again, try to sort of go through this teacher-learner kind of model in, and not an immersed sense of our oneness with all things. That's it came up for me when you talk about this, and it potentially seeming inaccessible when somebody says you're one with everyone else. So to your question.
Yeah, well, that this is an organic conversation, and I know that you have spoken before publicly about how we can learn the most from the people who are the most different from us sometimes.
Yeah. So there is a bit of a mantra that I hold, that those least like us have the most to teach us. And that came about through many different lenses that I've had, that included quite substantially my time as a defense lawyer and coming to really tell those stories of my clients and how much they had to teach me, and about how much privilege I had, frankly, in having I was born on third base, and I thought everyone was kind of swinging from home, with the same opportunities, and that clearly wasn't so. So they taught me a great deal, and I would have had a lot of judgment about their behavior before I became a defense lawyer and storyteller. But as you know, Nancy, my son Patrick is my greatest teacher, and Patrick is someone who was born with Down syndrome. He's on the autistic spectrum. He's nonverbal. He's 32 years old.
But he wasn't nonverbal for the first 9 years of his life.
Well, I'm not going to tell you the whole.
I'm
not going to take you through the whole story.
But his journey is important.
His journey is important.
I know.
And so part of that journey is that when we only knew him to have Down syndrome and not autism when he turned 9, it was that he was a profound teacher to us. But when his how he showed up in the world changed quite dramatically, and he became nonverbal at age 9, and in a sense, his reachability was that much further, and I needed to let go of all of my expectations and assumptions about how life was going to turn out for him, that I started to realize, okay, the more he shifted in a certain way from where I was, the more he taught me to actually slow down and to open up and to soften my heart to something that was really around me all the time, but so I get the incredible privilege now for 32 years to sort of be taught by this beautiful soul who, and I'm not alone in that. So many people who have others in their family who have differences are given the opportunity, and it's not the same for everyone. I know that it's not like it's easy every day, and it's not like it's really clear all the time, but that metaphor, and perhaps I'll bring it back to the engaged thing.
Yeah, I was just going there because it changed your whole vision of what success is.
Well, or how we get to where we want to be. It is that in the same way that colonial perspectives are it's like the water I've grown up in, I'm swimming in, and I'm now sort of trying to figure out what was that? What were the Euro? Try to get through all of that. Embedded in it would have been so many other assumptions about the way that we get cultured that often are about certain, what success looks like as an individual, as a society, what are we actually trying to do What are we trying to achieve? When we look to grow the economy, which has been something really since the Second World War that has created advantages for some countries that have actually closed the gap and made some segments of society well, we are nonetheless realizing that growth for its own sake is really fraught. It's fraught when we look at what it's meant for the environment, what it's meant for inequality, and now that inequality really causing tremendous, more than tremors, sort of earthquakes around whether democracy itself is going to be something that survives the period that we're in right now. It's going to be my trepidation is really quite high. So
it's like democracy is an endangered species, but is it? Would you be happy to? Well, no, that's too big a conversation.
Yeah, well, the engaged dimension of this in part, and we're doing it in a variety of ways. We're doing it through conversation. We're doing it through enhancing the ability for people to be more connected to each other. So our initiative that we've undertaken about, for example, Share Thanksgiving, opening your home to new Canadians for a meal every Thanksgiving time, something that we did for a number of years. And more recently, little campaigns that aren't hard to sort of undertake, one called From Me to You, which is a simple note writing campaign that builds connections from, a faceless bus driver to somebody who's riding the bus to the bus driver, where you leave them a note or something like that saying, I see you and thank you for smiling at me, or nodding, or something like that. By the thousands, we were successful during the pandemic to create a campaign for people to write each other and say, I see you, you matter, hang in there. To invitations to thousands of school kids in Nova Scotia to just do a thing that reaches across the aisle to somebody else. So all things in the space of making connections, because at the heart of it, and informed by certainly my experience of the richest traditions, is that relationships and connections, human connections and connections to the greater world, are at the essence of what makes a good society. But in order to get there, there is something in the nature of slowing down to the reality that we find ourselves in. So the predominant initiative that Engage is advancing right now is something called the Nova Scotia Quality of Life Initiative. And we're really, with our many partners, excited about the way in which we've done essentially a census on how Nova Scotians are doing. Almost 13,000 people answered 230 questions about some of the things that they sometimes answer in surveys, but many of the things about loneliness and sense of belonging, and about experiences of discrimination and things that often don't get asked, loaded into this ecosystem that we're now able to sort of analyze and look at, so that we can see with greater precision where are the essential pain points in a society, and how do we begin to sort of address those challenges more effectively. So we've got both the sense that social connections are at the heart of it, informed by traditions like Indigenous communities, and now we actually have real life evidence persuasively telling us that if we're going to get on top of many of our most obvious talked about challenges, including housing, child poverty, mental health, at the heart of that is actually bringing us together in relationship more effectively, and seeing each other and having that sense of oneness, that we're in this together, and that we'll have differences. There's a pluralistic society out there waiting for all of our differences to be expressed in free ways, for sure. But there's also a way that we've somewhat gotten away from, that sort of make the best of what we can be together, instead of just scattering like lone wolves that aren't going to get things done on our own.
That sounds to me like a definition of reconciliation. What does reconciliation mean to you in terms of the Indigenous people in Canada now?
Yeah, I would say that it is, it's a tricky word. I find it to be a tricky word. And I think that it's easy to sort of speak about reconciliation without really unpacking the many layers and the fact that it's ultimately a process. So the layers are personal, they're institutional, they're legal, they're about worldviews, they're about small communities and large communities, they're economic to a certain extent. At its heart, it's a concept that is about relationships, however. It's about seeing each other in a way that respects the different approaches to how we have two-eyed seeing, different ways of seeing the world, but that we're in it with each other, and we are committed to finding a path forward that is born from mutual respect and respect for each other, respect for the broader world, and increasingly I'd want to emphasize respect for the future generations that are really being dealt a blow in real time by the choices that we're making in our relationships with each other. So lots of assumptions that have been made, and as I said to you, near the beginning about restorative justice, and for that matter, it would have been about, relationships with Canada's First People from the time that I was a child, and sort of the unlearning and the willingness for each of us to go on the journey in whatever way it suits us to unlearn, and not just with our heads, but with our hearts, and spend our time with people in conversations that show that you really are genuinely interested in understanding more, and we'll all be in different places. We'll be in 38 million different places about the way that we sort of process what reconciliation in a Canadian kind of way might mean. But if we're generally moving that current in a direction of, open stillness and softness, if I would, then I'm confident that we'll get there.
And I feel when you're talking about that need for reconciliation to not just be at a governmental or organizational or community level even, but to be individual responsibility, I think about the fact that this center, Friends United, the initiative, is very much about, it may not be beyond reproach. Is it the perfect form of reconciliation? You say that, is there any perfect form? But it's an amazing example of an individual who happens to be Rolf, who is an immigrant, who said, I want to do my part to build bridges and to offer some sort of reconciliation. What was your response when you first were exposed to Friends United?
Yeah, so Rolf's amazing example is a really interesting one that I think can be a model for people who sort of are able to shine a light on, in this case, I think through art, really profoundly both all things associated with the importance of reconciliation and really meaning it, and being, putting your resources and time and talent behind something. But doing it through art strikes me as a stroke of genius, because art sort of just is another sort of way. It is the unseen in the sense that it is so implicitly and it's so integrally part of what we're all sort of moving through. And this allows for the expression of something that's almost beyond words when it's on a canvas, or if it's in a sculpture or something that sort of brings us to a place of appreciation that certainly we would never have gotten to when I was in the process of drafting agreements and that sort of thing, and rights reconciliation. It's something that's more integral to the full embodiment of, what reconciliation can show up as. And that's just a single mode amongst many, where it could be just an extra look in the eye, or something, or an intervention when a racist comment is sort of coming in a way that still comes from a place of tenderness, but really calls out the friend or relative or somebody else who you know just needs a little bit of a nudge to sort of, or a conversation to bring them to a place where we're seeing each other with, with more love.
Mm-hmm. With more love. I love the learning that I've had about this art this week, the perspective that much of it has been created, and speaking with the artists, I'm hearing often that this is part of their healing. So creating the art is an act of healing for them, but there is the opportunity for the viewer of the art. For me, for instance, it's healing to see it, to experience this art, to learn about it. And it all goes, that healing leads to a place of love and compassion and oneness.
Yeah, what you're reminding in me is the way that sometimes often art makes you feel in your body. If you go into a place like this and you have this kind of an experience, you go into a museum and it transports you. It is that slowing down. It's the opening up, and you can actually feel it in your body, that something's shifting in you. And so in that regard, being so fully surrounded by all of this beauty and wonder, I think it's a really wonderful way to sort of have an experience that no matter how rushed you are walking through the door, you slow down and you open up.
Energetically, you come into this place and you feel it. And it's an experience not of the intellect, but of the heart. Yeah. So art is the language of the heart in many ways, as is music, I guess. Thank you. This is a different conversation than we've ever had before, but I'm so appreciative.
I'm delighted to have the opportunity. Thank you for giving me a chance to share some questions as much as anything else, because I think we're all on this journey, and the more open we are about what questions we're holding, maybe the sooner we'll get along in the process for those children and their children to not struggle as much as the children of the past, in particular as we think about, Mi'kmaq children in this place from not that long ago.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We are Friends United.
We are Friends United.
We are Friends United.
Together, we are Friends United.